Okay, and welcome to our virtual PAX panel. What does a roguelike mean in 2020? My name is Clint Tasker. I'm going to host this panel. I'm half of Thorium with my partner Derek Johnson. We make Undermine. We also have Jeremy Parish of Retronauts podcast and YouTube channel. Wanderbot of the Wanderbot YouTube channel. Played a lot of roguelikes. We have Casey Yano, half of Megacrit, right? And makers of Slay the Spire. And we have Derek Yu, Mossmouth himself and developer of Spelunky and Spelunky 2. Welcome, everybody.
Yeah.
Hello.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks for having me.
We have put together a rogues gallery of experts, a rogue squadron. I'm out of
I was
puns. That's it.
prepared.
That's all. That's all I got. um, So yeah, first question for the room. What are the defining elements of a roguelike? What does a roguelike actually mean to you these days? And is the rogue part even important anymore? Who's first?
Well, what do you mean by the rogue part? Are you speaking specifically of the game Rogue?
I think the it seems in
Like, are you
recent
asking
years,
does it need to be ASCII text based and on a, on a
yeah,
networked computer? Like how pure does it have to be?
in
There,
recent
there's
years we've kind of stopped uh, inventing genres, and now we just call it like a game like. We have Souls like, we have Metroidvania, we have roguelikes. Yeah, and a lot of expectations around roguelikes are sometimes like it needs to be very much like Rogue. It needs to be turn-based, uh, you know, dungeon crawler or any of those things. And so I'm asking you all like what elements of that are actually important, and we've evolved quite a lot since Rogue, and so how much do you need to be like Rogue to be considered a roguelike, or is that actually an important question at all?
I would love it if we could come up with a better name for the genre, but nobody's been creative enough to like put forward a good name. I think I spent like 5 hours one night just trying to come up with alternative names, and I got nothing. So if anybody has suggestions, we could rename the genre. It's not too late.
Yeah, I had that thought recently. We called first-person shooters Doom clones for a couple
Yeah,
of years, and
exactly.
then we're like, oh wait, why don't we call them something better? So ego shooters was a thing for a while, and then first-person shooters kind of took over. But yeah, there hasn't really been anything that really kind of gets the point across as succinctly as roguelike, and it's such a kind of vague term, and has been applied to so many things that it, it starts to lose me a little bit. So I guess I don't think you can really say that there is a single proper definition for roguelike or a single trait that it necessarily has to have, because I think different audiences come expecting different things, and people who have deep roots in the roguelike genre, playing games like Rogue and NetHack, really expect something that is like not necessarily ASCII text but very unforgiving, has things like use ID and permanent death, and maybe monuments to where you fall, and just extreme difficulty, extreme unforgiveness. But people who have come into the genre or that style of game playing things like Spelunky aren't necessarily tied to that, and are a lot more open to broader definitions. So I'm always a little averse personally to putting a firm definition on a genre, because genres are just convenient boundaries that are really sort of like a reference point. And then, the best games often take elements of a genre and then go off in another direction. So I really enjoy just games that pick up that procedural generation and potential permanent death and some of those elements, but mix them in different ways and apply them to different styles of games. So I feel like for me, as long as a game kind of has a clear reason, like a really good reason for incorporating those elements, then they can call themselves a roguelike if they want. That's fine. It doesn't have to look like Rogue. It doesn't have to play it doesn't have to be as obtuse as Dwarf Fortress. It's fine, as long as it's fun, and it brings those elements of the roguelike genre in games like NetHack into its design in a meaningful way, and to make it a better and more interesting game, that's great for me.
Well
Yeah, I
said.
think it's a very broad genre. I think it's I liken it to RPG as a genre, where it's very broad, and it can be applied to so many different other genres. When you think of like RPG, like role playing game, as far as video games go, I mean, what does that mean? It's not like the perfect description, because you're playing a role in every game, right? So when we think of RPG, we're thinking about things like leveling up, where we tend to think about, very, very narrative driven, where we think about parties of characters and things like that. But it's not a very strict genre. I think things like Metroidvania, for example, to me feels like much more strictly defined to 2D side-scrolling platforming, um, compared to something like RPG. And I think roguelike is similar, just so broad. I think it's great as that too. I don't know that, like like Jeremy said, I don't think we necessarily need to pin it down.
I got a quick question before we move away from you. Did you call Spelunky a roguelike when you were originally making it, or is that actually a retroactive description? Because I remember playing it in 2008, and I don't remember people calling it a roguelike then.
Yeah, I mean, whenever I described it, I always described it as roguelike inspired. I was pretty careful not to, step on the toes of the traditional turn-based dungeon crawling roguelikes. I was pretty careful to call it like a roguelike inspired platformer.
Okay.
And yeah, that didn't last that long. I think it was really with The Binding of Isaac where people started calling The Binding of Isaac a roguelike, and then yeah, like you said, retroactively calling Spelunky a roguelike also. And then that's when the traditional roguelike community started to feel like, hey, people are taking our name, and fighting back. These days I feel like nothing is really called a roguelike, like just roguelike. Like the original roguelikes are called classic roguelikes or traditional roguelikes, and games are called roguelike platformers or action roguelikes, or roguelike deck builders and things like that. I feel like, yeah, I don't know what would fit the definition of just a roguelike these days, other than maybe like a very broad kind of umbrella category that includes everything that's roguelike adjacent. It's
Yeah,
it's interesting. I don't think it's a definition that we can really turn back at this point to just strictly defining those old turn-based. I mean, I shouldn't call them old. People are still making them, but like the traditional rogue, like Rogue with ASCII and all that. Like I think that, I don't know. I'm kind of a descriptivist when it comes to definitions, anyways, and it just feels like the genie's out of the bottle a little bit.
yeah, I think for like modern kind of roguelikes, I think what the descriptor means to me at least is it almost just means run-based gameplay. Like you can I feel like that's the framework that you really like if you think of Slay the Spire, or you think of Binding of Isaac, or you think of even Moonlighter or some of the lesser known ones. It's just really like permadeath is obviously part of that because permadeath is the end of the run, but it's that encapsulation of gameplay over a short amount of time and then something that you can repeat over and over and over again. And now with the addition of like the roguelite elements, the things that continue from run to run, there's just kind of a natural evolution of that. And the reason this is a question for later, but like the reason that appeals to me nowadays is as I get older and have less time to play games, having a a self-contained game that like kind of limits how long it takes is really valuable because I can take it in bite-sized pieces as much as I want, whereas like an open world like third-person action game can feel very daunting or overwhelming.
Yeah, to kind of make a counterpoint to what you just said about the run-based gameplay and permadeath, consider that the most played, the best-selling turn-based roguelike interpretation is definitely the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon series, which has a lot of those elements. It comes straight out of Sharon the Wanderer and the other mystery dungeon games. But the base game there doesn't have permadeath. You keep your levels when you die. You lose like half your inventory when you die, as opposed to everything. So there is this like safety net built into that stands in kind of stark defiance to what that genre is theoretically about. And you don't really get into the really super challenging modes until you get into the post game of a Pokemon Mystery Dungeon game, and that's a lot of people's kind of reference point. So even then, like it does kind of call into question what is absolutely essential to make the genre the genre.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's
There was
interesting. When I hear run based, I think about the fact that video games really started as run based games in the arcade, right? Like the original run based games are just arcade games where you don't continue with quarters. And then as video games have evolved, I think that's I think that style of playing games is really, now it's seen, I think, is very old fashioned, where you you play a game from the very beginning every time. And I think, with roguelikes, I think what it's done is it has it's a way of, kind of bringing that run based game back, but with a randomization. Because the other thing is that arcade games also have permadeath if you just choose not to continue when you die. You just so like it's interesting to me because there's a lot of, I think, similarities between old arcade games and roguelikes. I think the big difference is the randomization and maybe the depth of the interaction. And I think those two things, it's really like, to me, it feels like adding those two things to that old arcade style gameplay in order to kind of make it palatable for modern audiences. Whereas, I think with other genres of games, we've moved more towards open world exploration, these kind of longer form styles of games. Whereas I think roguelikes in a lot of ways are like, especially the real time, like modern ones, are like a way of sort of preserving that arcade style run based permadeath 1cc style of gameplay, while basically making it like interesting enough for modern audiences who don't want to just play like the same level over and over and over again until they've mastered it.
Yeah, the arcade description is really apt, and that's something that I kind of realized for myself back. Oh man, it was like 2008 or so when Sharon the Wanderer came out for DS, and I was reviewing it and trying to express the appeal of this game because at the time there, in the kind of console gaming space, there wasn't really any kind of widespread acceptance of that style of game. People would say, why would you want to play this? It's bad. It looks bad. It's not friendly. And I think in my review I said, like, you just have to approach this like Super Mario Brothers, where you play for a while and you run out of lives and you die, and you don't hate Super Mario Brothers because you have to go back to the start and play again, because you've learned things playing. That first run, you learned how the levels are laid out and where the power ups are and how they work and how enemies attack, and so next time you play, you do a better job of it. And this is the same thing. It's just in a different kind of presentation, a different paradigm. But the core appeal is still there, and it's very much about kind of learning the ropes and making mistakes and picking yourself up. And when you make a mistake, and then learning from that and avoiding those mistakes in the future. And the randomization element is a big part of it, because you can't just memorize, this enemy is going to attack here and this object going to appear here, and I can count on that. It forces you to improvise and say, well, this enemy, there's twice as many as I expected, and I have a completely different tool set than I did before. How can I use these tools to come out of this situation and still survive? And that's, I can see where that doesn't appeal to everyone, but I think as indie developers especially have really started to apply that methodology back into action games, it's made for some really interesting combinations and game variations that 15 years ago no one could even have conceived of. And it's great. It's exciting. It feels really fresh and new and different.
Yeah, so Casey, when you were developing, so kind of the same question for you is when you were developing Slay the Spire, were you intentionally making a roguelike, or did that description just kind of fit afterwards?
I think the core premise of Slay the Spire was not to make a roguelike per se, but it was to make a deck building game. So both Anthony and I, when we were working on the game, we wanted the core experience to be focused on the deck building, which we thought was missing in like the card game community, and not like we weren't looking at it from like a roguelike perspective. And at the time, I also happened to be like obsessed with roguelikes. I was getting deep into runs where I was trying to beat Yama and Spelunky. I was playing a lot of FTL, and I guess Binding of Isaac is like just goes on forever. So that was like the game when I needed to cool down from the other ones, maybe. So I guess it wasn't designed from a pure like let's make a roguelike kind of like place. I know that in our store page we had a deep discussion about whether we want to call the game a roguelike or a roguelite, because there was a lot of, folks being like, roguelike should only be games that fit the Berlin interpretation. And then we were like, it's fine if they're mad. Like that'll be publicity. It'll be okay. And so we just called it a roguelike. We're like, it's not ASCII, we get it. But
Yeah,
it's a run-based game.
We had the same discussions when we were putting Undermine up on the store, and kind of my thoughts were kind of in the vein of everything we're talking about. The moniker of like roguelike means so much now that almost having a subgenre doesn't even matter. Like, is there a meaningful distinction between a roguelike and a roguelite? Like, does anyone here have a strong opinion about that?
I would say Undermine is both. And I guess seeing as you guys are here, it makes it so easy. I don't know if the rest of you have played Undermine versus Undermine Othermine, which is Undermine is kind of rogue legacy. You guys can describe it better than I can, but you get gold carries over, get upgrades between runs, but all of those upgrades carry over. And then within the run, you get some smaller upgrades that kind of have the roguelike elements back in it. But when the run ends, you still get to keep X amount of gold, X amount of damage boosts, so on and so forth. And then Othermine, you guys just threw all of that meta progression out the window and said unlocks only. And maybe you have more than that, but I didn't really see it. I haven't played as much Othermine as I'd like to, because Undermine destroys my hands every time I play it. But I actually really appreciated that distinction, that playing your game really drew the line in the sand in my head of what was a roguelike, at least the modern roguelike, if you throw Berlin out the window, and then roguelite in a much clearer manner than I think I've seen drawn anywhere else.
Oh, that's great to hear. Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. There was a great GDC talk given in 2015 by Tom Cadwell, who was a designer at Blizzard for a while. I think he works at Riot currently. And beyond just the roguelike is run based, and when you die, you lose all your stuff. That's kind of the naive interpretation I think a lot of people have. He broke down sort of the things that happen within the run into sort of maybe 5 key elements. And a couple of those really stuck with me while we're developing Undermine. One of them was making do. So as you go on your run, you're going to get a lot of variety in the items that you find and the enemy variation that you encounter. And you're just going to have to make do with the hand that you're dealt. And I felt that that was such a key component to what makes a run in a roguelike interesting, is that you just don't always get everything that you want. Things don't always come up Millhouse for you. You're going to be dealt a weird hand, and you just have to deal with it. And while we're developing the core mode of Undermine, I felt like we were missing some key tools that we didn't have access to in order to allow players to feel that feeling of making do. And a lot of those were because they were supplanted by the upgrades that you get outside of the run. So that kind of fueled the impetus for us to make this more pure mode where you have to make some really hard trade-offs on your run. There's opportunity costs that you're leaving behind, and you have to commit to a build. And if you make a wrong decision early on in your run to the build that you're thinking you're committing to, that'll end your run. And that was so much the pure rogue-like run based, where there's nothing, you're not taking anything into the run with you, really allowed us to express that a lot more, I felt. So one other point I'd like to throw out is that I think that as we were making Undermine, I considered it a roguelike initially, but it was for strange reasons. I just didn't want to implement a save system. So I figured, permadeath, you lose it all, we don't have to write anything to disk. It's fine. That was a very simple, kind of naive reason to go about making a roguelike. It doesn't always have to be this deep, meaningful decision as you start your game. I think we've seen that with all the games here.
Yeah, it's weird because I still remember when roguelite just meant, a light traditional roguelike. I think of games like Powder or something like that. It's like a simple turn-based procedural dungeon crawler. Basically, it's like a coffee break. What they call now, I think, a coffee break roguelike would have been called a roguelite. It'd be like Yoda Stories or something like that. I don't know if anyone remembers that game, but yeah. So I don't know. Roguelite has not really caught on with me. I kind of have to force myself to use it.
Yeah, the Rogue Legacy developers kind of they're the ones that I would blame for the change in definition, because they started calling themselves
Yeah.
a roguelite very specifically.
Oh, is
and
that where it
caught
came
on
from?
Super hard. Yeah, they're the first game to like truly advertise themselves as a roguelite instead. And I think they set the division there, especially with the meta progression. And I think they were a huge influence for. I mean, I can see their fingers, I guess, in every meta progression system I've seen in almost every roguelike afterwards. I mean, obviously Undermine. I've seen it in Gunfire Reborn recently. I've seen it in a bunch of different games, and it's interesting seeing subsequent roguelikes try and separate themselves from that meta progression system in an interesting manner.
I think I had a lot to do with bringing in roguelite elements into Undermine, or more, Rogue Legacy was essentially the first roguelike I really got into because it was softer. It was
Yeah.
easier to play because you kept something. And obviously there are a lot of other games like that, and even ones earlier than Rogue Legacy, but um, when I quit and became an indie developer, I wanted to make sure we were successful and we could continue doing this, and so I wanted to have broad appeal. And I always felt like Rogue Legacy had that broad appeal where, um, I mean, obviously other more hardcore roguelikes, Spelunky and games like that, and Isaac, they have their insane broad appeal, but it just seemed easier to present RPG elements to people because like that just seems to be the thing that people love in any genre. And so in a way, yeah, I was too cowardly to take that hardcore roguelike stance. And then later, the reason Othermine exists is because we actually really appreciate that gameplay and want to also have that available available in our game.
Yeah, that's I think a major distinction between modern roguelikes is just how much can you kind of do you have that like permanent progression or upgrading of your character in between runs. And yeah, I think it's just like a what style or do you like best, and what are you going for your particular game. But I do think it is a major distinction, how much do you keep between runs, and how much do you improve, like beyond your own skill. What does the game kind of give you in between runs to improve and level up. I think that's a pretty major distinction. And yeah, I think generally with players, I think they do appreciate having that kind of progress in between runs, because it can be frustrating to just hit a brick wall, in a game, and not feel like you're progressing at all. At least to not have the game sort of acknowledge that you're progressing with some kind of leveling up system. But yeah, I think that is kind of that's a new, or that's a system that I think is gonna vary from game to game and keep evolving.
So why do you all feel, or why do you all think that this genre it seems to be getting more and more popular? Or maybe, I don't know if it's reached its peak, but you'll see comments. I mean, there's definitely negative comments out there of like, oh, another indie roguelike, and people almost roll their eyes now. But but it does feel like it has kind of penetrated the mainstream almost, and now we're seeing it applied to a lot of different genres. Do any of you have an opinion on why you think this has really caught on more recently?
I have a lot. I think one of the main things is, was it Derek that mentioned this? That I, the core gameplay loop, the fact that most roguelikes are very arcadey, you're very focused on your core gameplay loop, and then everything else is just bonus on top of that. And let's take recent example, Ghost of Tsushima. Great game, but very long, and you spend a lot of time just kind of going through it, trying to reach that end. But with a roguelike, you can have a bite-sized 1 hour experience of pure gameplay without a whole lot of distraction. And with the exception of maybe like Hades that interrupts it with bits of story here and there, there are rarely dull moments except for maybe like the first level of a run. And then otherwise, you are engaged the entire time. There's no slow bits, there's no boring bits. And then you're done and you move on and you can do another run or you can stop and get back to work or something like that. And I think that appeals to people in a way that, most other games are an investment that you can't just sit down for 2 hours of, well, Ghost of Tsushima, Persona 5, whatever. You can't get 2 hours in and really feel like you made it somewhere. But I could be 3 runs of Slay the Spire in that period of time and feel fulfilled, or disappointment if RNG is not my favorite. But like that feeds into itself. That it doesn't always go my way, and so there is that feeling that I want to play more. And then you're never done. I am done with a billion games at this point. I don't know how many games I've completed, but I don't have a whole lot of compunction to go back to anything other than the roguelikes because there's still always something left for me in a roguelike. Most of the time.
Yeah, that brings a question to my mind that is kind of unrelated, but like, do you think a roguelike owes it to you to be beatable every single time?
No.
Or is it
I
okay if a run just ends you?
I think if it ends me, I prefer it if a roguelike ends me in an interesting manner, that it feels like a struggle. I've definitely had a number of runs where I'm just like coasting on absolute blandness and I just want to die to be, to have that RNG. And so I don't need it to be beatable every time, but if I'm going to get crushed, I do want the roguelike to make it interesting that I am getting crushed. I guess Slay the Spire is an easy example. The Timekeeper. I can't tell you how many times I'd run into one of the last bosses who you were given a set 12 actions before he stops you and then gets stronger and then hits you. And so you can play only 12 cards in that period. And I have a number of runs where I would have shivs, very low, weak weapons, weapon cards, I don't know, weak damaging cards, and you play 30 of them in a round because you can generate that many. But running up against the Timekeeper, it's a hard wall and my build is doomed. And I didn't know that this boss was coming until I hit the 3rd tier, and so maybe I can scramble to fix my build, come up with some kind of hard counter. Or I'm just screwed and I'm just trying to make the most of it, but it feels interesting because I tried my best. And so I don't feel like every roguelike needs to be beatable, but losing has to be just as fun as winning. Maybe. At least it should be.
Yeah, I always really enjoy the mystery dungeon games, the kind of the core ones like Sharon the Wanderer, because they are built heavily around the developers know that you're going to die a lot, and that not every run is going to be successful, and that you're probably going to fail more often than you succeed. And so there is, we were talking about the metagame element earlier, and there your character himself does not have any sort of metagame growth applied to him. He always starts out as 0, like level 1 at the very beginning. But there are elements like the town and the warehouse where every time you play, you can invest money into shops or into restaurants or into people who need help within the towns. And progressively, as you play, the investments you make there will accumulate. Or you can store a weapon that you really like in the warehouse where you don't take it into the dungeon, but you can apply, hone it with scrolls and things like that to make it more powerful. And so every time you play, you put a little toward that, And it makes the game a little easier because the helper characters will come out more often, or the restaurants might give you foods to buff you as you go into the later portions of the dungeon. And those aren't things that are available in the early runs of the game. They're only possible because you're going into the dungeon, you're making it further, you're saying, well, I'm going to take some of this cash that I've earned and I'm going to spend it here in town before I head back out into the dungeon. And it does build you up over time. And so yeah, I think if a roguelike is built to take advantage of the fact that you're going to fail, then it means that failure isn't quite so damning. It doesn't feel so frustrating because you've made some sort of progress along the way to help future runs.
Now, is it possible though, if you understand Sheeran inside and out, to beat it on the very first run? I have beaten Sheeran a long time ago, but I don't remember exactly how it works. Is it possible, like if you're an expert at the game and you just pick up a clean save file, can you beat it on the first time?
Probably, but it's going to be really hard. You're going to hit rust traps that'll cause your armor to rot, or you'll come across things that you don't have the ability to counter. And there's no way to counter everything that the game throws at you every time, but the longer you play and build up, stuff in your warehouse, then you can say, well, I'm going to take this into the dungeon and be better prepared. But yeah, I'm sure it's possible to beat the game on the first run, but I don't think it's really built with the assumption that you're going to do that. I think you'd have to get a really lucky RNG on that and
Okay.
just make some very good decisions that pay off by pure luck.
Okay. It would be luck based at that point. Gotcha.
It is kind of like an interesting divide because yeah, the thing that we found with our game, like our game is kind of balanced in a way like Dark Souls, where you could beat the entire run on your very first try, but you'd have to have perfect play, and also the later enemies would be insanely difficult for you to overcome because you'd have no upgrades. And obviously, a game like Spelunky, which is also an action game, like if a player can play perfectly and like they'd have to have knowledge of the game beforehand probably, but they could beat the game on their first run as well. Whereas a turn-based game like Spire that employs more strategy and because like Wanderbot said, when you've invested into a certain deck type, you can run into a wall that's very hard to overcome. Um, it does feel like if you're going to make a strategy or a turn-based game in this vein, you do have to deal with this question more because you're probably just going to have walls in your game that are impossible to overcome. Where action inherently has the player's skill that can overcome any obstacle, no matter how underpowered you are, as long as you have patience or insanely good play. Oh no, we can't hear you, Casey. Or I can't.
Yeah.
Is my voice on?
You're kind of
It's just-
robotic.
Yeah, it's a little
Yeah, and
garbled.
very quiet too.
Oh no. What am I gonna do? Alright, maybe I won't talk about what I'm trying to talk about until
You're kind of
until
better.
my network
It's getting a
stabilizes.
little better. It's a
It's
little
getting
better.
better? I
Yeah.
just have to talk to it more?
Yeah,
I think you
Yeah.
just have to be closer, maybe.
you have to
I
get
just
more
have to be
intimate with
really,
it.
really close. Oh, okay.
Yeah,
that's-
that was
there
it.
you go. That's it.
Okay. When I was playing FTL quite a bit, I remember that I felt like I was running into these kind of walls, like I'm going for a missile build, but I can't buy any missiles because the stores aren't selling missiles, and so trying to like kind of like make this issue less prominent when we were making Slay the Spire was just we just wanted an incredible amount of decision points, and so at least you can be like, hey, if I didn't like lazily try to go through like one or two fights before, maybe I could have made it. Maybe if I had chosen cards that synergize better with my deck, or like should I have cleaned out my deck, or should I have been really greedy and gone for like this relic or whatever instead. And so I guess adding more and more decision points tries to mitigate that. Obviously, things can still not go your way in many other aspects at the same time. So there is some dice rule, but I do sometimes envy action games where it's like where nobody can absolutely be like, this game is impossible. And you're like, you know what? Even if you did 1 damage and the enemy had 10,000 health, if you played perfectly, technically it's a beatable game. So the game is fair.
They'll still say it's unfair. Don't worry.
So
What was I gonna say? With Spire, did you think about like did you actively encourage people to have a more balanced build, or did you want them to be able to go a little more hardcore into like niche builds?
That is a personality preference, I would say.
Yeah.
You can play to win, being consistent, understanding the stats, knowing the numbers, knowing the chances. Or you can just be like, you know what? Like, I just want the weirdest stuff to happen, so I'm just gonna go full chaos, right? And that's like
Yeah.
a distinction that you are allowed to make based on how drunk you are, okay? And that's like, just do it. And
I
so,
think that you get it to a very important point with the RNG aspect of these games, in that it does allow players to have an incredible amount of ownership or a sense of creativity over the game. Yeah, you can play boring and safe and have a very average build, or you can just see how these systems interact with one another. And I think it's fun from a design standpoint to reward the more creative people and try and incentivize those kind of more niche builds or kind of actions.
Yeah,
I
Casey,
definitely-
did you think at all about the those three archetypes that they always talk about? I think it originated from Magic the Gathering.
Yeah,
It's like
Timmy,
Timmy's,
Spike, and John.
yeah, Timmy, Spike, and what's the last one?
Johnny's the last one.
Johnny. Yeah,
Johnny.
there's like
Yes.
three different play styles.
So
Yeah.
so my partner in the game is like the card game guy. And so to me, I'm just explaining like roguelike mechanics and roguelike mechanics, and then just like trying to find ways to make a game more accessible. And I also just enjoy designing content. And my partner Anthony, he really enjoys talking about kind of like the whole meta of like how card games should be built like compositionally. And so when we create cards, we definitely have a lot of tags of like what kind of category of cards they are. These are cards that are more simple, that work with a variety of builds, or sometimes they're like go all in on a certain type of build. And we just have to make sure that the composition is really good. Otherwise, it would just feel like if you don't go crazy, the game won't feel fair, and or the other way around, where like creativity isn't rewarded. And we just have to tweak that over a very long period of time. But those are just learnings from apparently card game design. So
So that's interesting. Your team is like split right down the middle with like a card game person and a roguelike person
I would,
to make
yeah, I would
to make a
definitely tweak that.
roguelike deck building game. Yeah, I wonder if there's like if there's going to be a market for, you know, roguelike specialists or consultants, like how to integrate roguelike elements
I will roguelikeify
into
your
your game.
game.
Yeah, exactly.
When AAA studios start to
Yeah.
discover how popular they are and start
I
hiring
have some
up.
bad news for you.
Well, it was interesting that yeah, Bloodborne had those chalice dungeons, which I was wondering for a while whether there would ever be any triple A triple A roguelike games, and the chalice dungeons was in Bloodborne were kind of like that. I mean, it's just a kind of a small part of Bloodborne. I don't know if
Yeah.
that's
Yeah, I think
I
the
wish they
other
put in more effort in that.
AAA has come was Prey Moon Crash, which was pretty good.
Mhm.
I liked that one. It didn't have the procedurally generated levels, just like loot and enemies, but it was roguelite-ish. But I think that's the closest it's come. I think the big problem is just no one's ever fully committed to a roguelike style within the AAA market, just because it's probably unsafe, and if you don't do it, you're doomed. So make that open world RPG.
The
Part of-
roguelike. Okay.
Part of roguelike development is like an insane amount of content as well. And when you start to get into like AAA echelons, like I think the thing people don't understand about graphics in AAA games is it has nothing to do with horsepower or anything like that. Now it has everything to do with money. Like the amount of money to make high fidelity games is insane. You have to have so many people. And so layer that on top of like Slay the Spire probably has like, do you have over 1,000 cards? Does that exist?
I think we have, let's see, we have 75 per character. I think it's about 350, 400.
Okay, so 400 cards in Spire. Undermine probably has like 400-ish items as well, and so then you start to get those numbers into like AAA, like artist values, and it gets very expensive.
Yeah, I mean, I think roguelikes it's a very uncontrolled style of game. I mean, you're designing rules and kind of seeing what comes out of it and trying to create as many possibilities you can. And I think you know, with a successful roguelike, the developer, by the time they release the game, really can't even see all the possibilities. And I think that's a lack of control that I think is kind of difficult for AAA studios to deal with. You know, I mean, you're sinking like millions and millions of dollars into a game, and I think not having that control over your game by the time it releases, where there are like a billion different little edge cases, I think makes it kind of a tricky prospect, or not as appealing a prospect. But you know, I think that's also what makes it so fun to make, you know, as an indie developer, because it's like you're constantly surprised by your own game. And so it's like, as you're developing a roguelike, it really feels like you're, you know, you feel like a player of the game throughout the entire development, right? Because, you know, even by the end, it's still fresh, which is, I think, a pretty unique feeling to have as a creator of anything. You know, I mean, most things are more static. I think even in video games, where you have that unpredictable element of interactivity. But roguelikes is really like, you know, you really feel like a mad scientist, is how I've always described it, which I think it's one of the reasons why it's so popular as a genre for indies. It's because I think for indies it's okay to, you know, not have as strict control over your game and its development, and then you're just constantly surprised. So you're kind of getting that, you know, the same sort of like rush that players get when they start a new run of a roguelike. I think developers get that too while they're working on it.
Yeah,
But
there,
it would take a AAA company, I think, that is willing to, you know, loosen their grip on their game to do like a roguelike game that's just a roguelike, and it's not kind of like a side part of the game.
I assume it's just going to leak into the AA industry a bunch, because I forgot one other example is the Remnant from the Ashes survival mode. So I think it's just going to slowly leak upwards until somebody's willing to pull the trigger. We're probably going to see more like roguelite modes. Actually, World of Warcraft is adding a roguelike mode. I totally forgot about this, but they're actually adding it in the new expansion. No idea if it's going to be any good, but I think that's the closest to the top level acceptance of the genre that I think I've
Interesting.
ever seen.
Yeah,
So I actually.
Derek.
Hmm.
Oh,
Oh, sorry. I was gonna. This is a long conversation, so maybe you should go first.
okay. I was just going to say, Derek, what you were saying earlier about the lack of control that is difficult for AAA developers. I think that gets back to the question earlier about the growth and popularity of roguelikes, because AAA experiences are so polished and so carefully vetted. You know, there were stories that have been coming out about The Last of Us 2, and about how basically like every interaction you have, every emotional beat is basically focus grouped to the point of you know, almost, I would say sterility. That's not fair to the game, but to the point where they know it's carefully calculated how people are going to respond to that moment. And you know, we've been seeing stories about that since, I think, Halo 3. I remember, you know, reading in Wired News about how they tested the levels over and over again until there was zero confusion about exactly what you're supposed to do. And it does create a thrilling experience where there's, you know, there's no ambiguity. It's just like go, go, go. But I think people appreciate not having that safety net, about being able to, some people, you know, appreciate being given the opportunity to just go out into the world and have experiences that weren't necessarily crafted, that are dynamic, that, you know, emerge from the moment. And it is very different than what you get in AAA games. So you know, I think it's kind of a reaction to that, and to the, you know, like what we saw especially with Nintendo games like a decade ago, where they were just filing off all the edges, and you know, having a little sword character pop up to say, "Hey, Link, guess what? Here's what exactly you should do in this moment. Okay, I'm going to be back in like 2 minutes to tell you the next thing you need to do." You don't get that in a roguelike. It's about discovery and about making mistakes and being given the room to make your own mistakes. And you know, a lot of players miss that and appreciate being given that level of trust, and I guess, you know, being treated, you know, as if they were mature and intelligent by developers, and able to kind of say, oh, well, I screwed up. That wasn't the game's fault. That was me. Let's try again.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you have a big budget as a AAA game and you want to give players more freedom and more agency, you're gonna just make like a giant open world. Like you're gonna take that budget and you're just gonna make like a huge land to explore. Whereas I think roguelikes, it's a similar thing you're doing. It seems strange because it's like run based, but I really feel like with Spelunky, I just with roguelikes in general. But when I'm working on Spelunky, I've been thinking about it recently. Like it's a type of open world in some sense. If you think about like all the different possible levels that you get, if you put them all side by side, in a lot of ways, it feels like you're creating this huge space, even though it's, every time you play, it's narrow across like a lot of runs. I think there's a feeling of an open world, and that's something that I've been kind of playing with Spelunky too, with like multiple branching paths and stuff like that. So I see a lot of parallels, I think, between AAA studios, designing these giant open worlds like, I don't know, GTA Breath of the Wild, and indies making roguelikes, because I think they both give the player a feeling of agency and freedom in what they want to do. But with roguelikes, it's more like, you're doing it in these smaller slices. So yeah, I don't know. I think it's one of those cases where I think with indie game developers where you see a possibility within the constraints that you have to work with as far as those limited resources go. Yeah. So I don't know.
I have a designer friend who is adamant that PUBG is a roguelike. It's run based. Every time you drop in, you're dropping in a different area on the map. Sorry, we can split this.
Everyone is stomping on Casey's hot takes.
No, I think that's totally true. I think it's a great observation. Yeah. And I think
the gear you get is random. The encounters that you encounter are random. It's just a quick run-based thing, and you get better at the game. It has all the elements, all the interesting trappings. Yeah. Go ahead, Casey.
I was just gonna say that. Hey, a AAA company wanted everything they wanted from roguelike, right? Infinite replayability, chaos, emergent gameplay. It's great for streaming. It's bite-sized, and on top of that, right? It's a social experience as well, which is very difficult for indie developers to make. Network games in general are very difficult. Mm-hmm. And so I was just like, I guess battle royales are the roguelikes for AAA. Like, at least like between my developers and we always talk about the same kind of things. So
yeah, I think what's happening is that we're coming up with a lot of different terms and words for essentially like a similar feeling and a general direction that I think video games are just going, which is just like more open, more agency, and I think real consequences for like making a mistake or losing in a game. And that's something that PUBG definitely has, where and what makes it so tense, right, is because it comes down to like a firefight between you and another person, and the person that loses, like, they're out, and they lose that. You can always hop back into another match, but you've lost that current match. And I think that's the similar thing with roguelikes, where I always felt like, it's not like you're just losing what you have done in that particular run, or like the items that you've collected, but you've lost that entire world. And I think that's I don't know. I think there are these ideas that are just really compelling and work really well, I think, in the modern age of streaming and stuff like that. Just the feeling of tension being one of those things. And roguelike is one way of doing that. I think these multiplayer online games, battle royales, are a way of doing that. And it's just like a lot of different ways of kind of saying the same thing in some ways. I even think about games like Getting Over It or Jump King, where you make a mistake and you just fall all the way to the bottom. I think there are elements in those games too, which have become really popular recently, which are also in roguelikes. I mean, it's a form of permadeath to drop like 5 screens or whatever in Getting Over It or Jump King.
It's
And
Makes
almost
for great TV too. People
yeah,
love watching
exactly.
that on stream.
it's
Yep.
almost
Yeah, exactly.
counterculture to like the like mid 2000 early or late 2000s game design of like those games are getting very handholdy, like Jeremy was saying earlier, and like a save checkpoint would go off like every 5 minutes or even less than that, and then kind of starting with maybe even Demon's Souls, it comes out and everyone's like, oh yeah, hard games are actually good and we don't need this hand holding. And roguelikes are just like an extension of that. I mean, they've been there the whole time too. Um, but going back to the emergent gameplay that Casey was talking about and the mad scientist thing, I think as a developer, this genre is very attractive because there's that moment where you're developing a roguelike and your game surprises you as a developer, which like it's a very like in any other genre it never happens. Like the emergence doesn't equal what you're developing in a roguelike. And so yeah, when something comes together and you're like, oh, I didn't actually anticipate that interaction, and then it's even more exciting as a developer when it doesn't break and it doesn't cause a bug and it's actually fun. Um, but I think when you reach that point, you start to understand that your game is going to be entertaining for players. If you can surprise yourself, then players are certainly going to be surprised. And you have to have a lot of confidence as I think as a systems and mechanics designer, it's also really fun because you have to have a lot of confidence in what you're building so that those thousands and millions of interactions are going to bounce off of each other without causing like an insane amount of destruction. They're going to lead to more positive outcomes than negative outcomes.
Yeah, no disagreement from anyone
Yep.
on what you just said.
I feel like it's maybe a little bit unfair to attribute that type of emergence to just roguelikes, though. To me, this is just purely a consequence of variety and well-designed systems. If you have a hazard system in your game and everything in the world can light on fire, then you're going to see some emergence just because you chose to have everything in the world interact uniformly. You don't treat items differently from enemies, differently from the player. If all of those are essentially the same entity and they can have all the same statuses applied to them, you're going to have that wild emergence happening. And we do see this a lot in roguelikes, certainly, but I think that this is just more of a good fundamental game design decision rather than any particular attribute of a roguelike.
Yeah, I think the appeal of Breath of the Wild was that interaction and like it was twofold for me. It was getting away from Zelda being the insanely handholdy thing that it had become, and also them really embracing just physics and things bouncing off one another to create like a really interesting thing. Um, I look forward to seeing where they go with that.
Yeah.
We sorry. I was just gonna say
Oh.
we have like 5 minutes, maybe not even that. This has been a good conversation. It's gone very fast. But what did you want to say, Derek?
Oh, all I was gonna say was, yeah, I think the more in common that like a player character can have with a potion in a roguelike, I think the more, interesting kind of interactions you're gonna get out of it. Like at a fundamental level, if a player is very similar to a potion, like as close as you can get, then yeah, the more interesting it's gonna be.
Are you saying you should be able to do everything to a potion that you can do to a box? You can pick it up, you can stand on it, you can throw it, you
Yeah, that you
can.
should be able to, if you can do the same things that you could do to like a monster as to a potion,
Yeah.
as to a brick, I think the more interesting, the interactions are going to be, and the more surprising.
I
Oh,
don't
You
know.
yeah,
know,
yeah,
the closer it gets to real life, really.
Yeah, I don't know how you guys
Yeah,
feel, but as a developer, often like you don't want to do things superfluously because it's wasted effort, but it almost feels like in this space you almost develop things with faith. Um, you're yeah, like you're saying, like, oh, we're gonna let you do anything with this potion, which is an extreme amount of work, and you don't even necessarily see the payoffs, but then down the line, this interaction leads to this interaction leads to this other interaction, and then you realize, oh, the fact that I made it so that a potion bounces off your head just like a monster would, like it allows for this interaction to happen and creates like really special moments.
Yeah, you should always have a bug in your game at some point where it is possible to try to drink a monster, basically.
Yeah, Derek, I got to give you a lot of the credit for that. I think you talked about this in your book, and we took that a lot of that stuff to heart and Undermine, where everything in the world is exactly the same, and we've had exactly those types of bugs that you're talking about, and it's infuriating on one hand, but it's really exciting on the other hand, and I think players love the players especially who are following along with the development of your game, like we had throughout early access. They love seeing that stuff. They love the drama and they love the weird bugs, and they just can't conceive of how a bug like this could exist, but it's hilarious to watch. So you get a lot of free passes, I think, through the bug development and the bug fixing phase if your bugs are funny enough, and this certainly leads to funny bugs.
Well, with that, I have to cut it off. Even though this is a virtual panel, we still have a time limit. This has been incredibly fun. I love talking about this kind of stuff with all of you. Um, I think Spelunky 2 comes out a couple days after this goes live. When are you coming out?
Yeah, around this time, it should either be out or it's coming out soon.
Are you ready?
I think so. Yeah, I think I'm ready. I don't know. I'm old. I'm old now. So I give less of a poop about, I think, the like I did the best I could, and that's all you can do, and I'm okay with that these days. So
Okay.
I'm excited. I'll leave it at that.
We are too. The world I think is holding its breath right now for Spelunky 2. So no
Oh
pressure.
wow. Well, thank you.
But it's a landmark.
I wasn't gonna say anything.
It's going to redeem 2020. That's what everyone's banking on.
Oh,
Wow.
Absolutely.
wow, that's a high
pressure.
bar. Okay, well,
Yeah.
with that bombshell, good luck with Spelunky 2, and thank you
very
all
much.
for joining in this conversation. And that's it. See you later.